Good evening. Tonight we begin with something a little more bittersweet than a lullaby. Laudanum, the Victorian tincture that promised to wash away pain and hush the world for a while. Forget the gaslit romance of corsets and carriage rides. Behind those polished veneers were bottles of opium tincture and secret doses passed like consolation. The truth is, dropped into a Victorian parlour, you'd probably be offered laudanum before you were offered a sympathetic word. It was the quiet crutch that kept people moving through unbearable days. If you're enjoying this, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. I'm always fascinated by the variety of places people are watching from. Now, dim the lights, silence your notifications, take a deep breath, and let's drift into the hushed, opiate-scented corners of Victorian life. Paracelsus, the itinerant Swiss physician whose full name, Philippus Aurelius Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, reads like an incantation, and whose life, 1493 to 1541, was a catalogue of contrarian gestures, is where the modern story of laudanum quietly begins. He stood, by the accounts that have survived, with an alembic and a brimstone-smudged temper in the cramped laboratories and university halls of 16th century Europe, insisting that medicine must be chemical as well as humoral, that the physician's art could and should borrow the hammer and bellows of the alchemist. Opium itself was not new. The sap of the poppy had been traded and prescribed across the Mediterranean, across the Islamic hospitals of Baghdad and Cairo, and through the pages of Galen and Dioscorides for a millennium. But what Paracelsus did was to take that ancient gummy substance and transform it into something that would travel with him. A potent tincture, dissolved in wine or spirit, perfumed with saffron, myrrh and other botanicals, and presented as a concentrated, transportable remedy for a bewildering array of ills. He called his preparation laudanum, praise perhaps literal in its etymological hint to laudare, but the name stuck because the potion came praised for its ability to still coughs, ease cramps, hush fevers and calm the fretful senses. It was therapy and theatre wrapped in glass. From the laboratories of the Paracelsianly inclined to the wooden counters of the apothecaries, the tincture moved with the slow inevitability of any good idea in an age of merchants and guilds. In Florence and Padua, in Cologne and Antwerp, in London's winding lanes and the cramped calling card-strewn shops of Paris, apothecaries took Paracelsus's notion and made it their own. Each shop became a little chemistry, each apothecary a local interpretive scholar. There was no single recipe that would have offended the sensibilities of the trade and the practicalities of supply. Opium itself came in variable quality. Greek, Levantine, later Asian varieties, wine and spirits had differing strengths and flavours, and saffron or cinnamon were luxury goods that might be used sparingly in one town and liberally in another. Sometimes myrrh or frankincense were macerated alongside the poppy. Sometimes the tincture bore a faintly camphorous note. The amber fluids were kept in small phials with cork stoppers, labels scrawled by hand, some sealed with wax. The apothecary's counter smelled in winter of dried herbs and old brandy, in summer of resin and the faint sweetness of opium. The result was that laudanum became not a single pharmaceutical but a family, an umbrella term umbrellaed over dozens of locally made tinctures, all claiming to alleviate pain and quell distress, each with its own temperament. This was a medicine of translation, translated across languages, translated from alchemical theory into domestic practice. The guilds and corporations that regulated apothecaries in cities like London, where the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries was established in 1617, made the apothecary both a respected tradesman and a social node, someone to be consulted and sometimes mistrusted, the keeper of mixtures that balanced efficacy with poison. Bodies of knowledge travelled too. Domestic servants and housewives copied recipes into their manuscript books. Midwives carried small wrapped vials tucked into their aprons. A 17th century recipe might tell you to macerate opium in a quart of red wine with 3 drachms of saffron and a little cinnamon. A language partly of weights and partly of memory. Another shop would sell laudanum made from pearl spirits and camphor, bitter and penetrating. What mattered less in those years was standardization than availability and trust, that the tincture existed, and that a competent apothecary could summon it when a cough kept a child awake or labour needed to be calmed. So when Thomas Sydenham entered the English scene in the mid-17th century, his endorsement carried a particular kind of weight. Sydenham, 1624 to 1689, long hailed as the English Hippocrates, practised in London and became famous not for arcane theory but for careful observation and the pragmatic use of effective remedies. He published his Observations Medicae, first appearing in the 1670s, a book that collected cases and favoured therapeutic empiricism over speculative humoral juggling. Sydenham did not invent laudanum, but he did confer upon it a kind of clinical respectability. He recommended opium tinctures for conditions that resisted gentler measures, severe pain, certain fevers, and other maladies that required sedation rather than purging. His name became attached to a set of recipes and to a reputation. Sydenham's laudanum appeared in physicians' manuals and in the lists of remedies kept by apothecaries. It was shorthand not for a single formula, but for a trusted approach to opium-based tinctures, measured, discreet, and to be used by those who had seen the patterns of disease. That attachment of a physician's name mattered. Medicine in the 17th and 18th centuries was a collaborative negotiation across social and professional boundaries. Physicians, often gentlemen educated at universities, wrote prescriptions in a language of grains and scruples. Apothecaries, skilled in the practical chemistry of compounding, interpreted those prescriptions and advised on substitution when a particular spice was scarce or when the local opium was weak. The negotiation was also one of authority. Who could decree a dose and who would measure it? This was not merely a matter of ego. There was real consequence in the variability of formulations. The opium poppy's alkaloid content ebbed and flowed. Alcoholic solvents extracted different proportions depending on strength and duration of maceration. The addition of pungent aromatics could hide the taste of a stronger brew, encouraging heavier consumption. A physician might recommend laudanum for a cough and expect a measured drop or spoonful. An apothecary might prepare a tincture so robust that a spoonful produced a deeper sedation than the doctor had imagined. Conversely, an apothecary coy about the expense of opium might dilute a tincture so thin that it failed to comfort. Recipe books and professional pharmacopoeias tried, piecemeal, to address this chaos. By the late 17th and 18th centuries, printed pharmacopoeias attempted to fix formulations for tinctura opiae and other opium preparations. Yet standardization was always partial, a compromise between the ideal of uniform strength and the practicalities of supply and patronage. Ships brought opium in chests from the eastern Mediterranean and, as the centuries turned, from the fields of India. Merchants, acting on both profit and taste, sold different grades. Local preference shaped recipes. In the Netherlands, where the Dutch East India Company wove a network that touched Asia and the Cape, apothecaries might favour brandy-rich tinctures. In rural England, wine might be substituted with local spirits. Laudanum remained a potion with a regional accent. Home preparation sustained that multiplicity. Domestic manuscript from the late 17th century, scribbled in the careful hand of a housewife or a reedy-inked table of a gentlewoman, might contain a recipe labelled simply laudanum, alongside salves for burns and poultices for swelling. Midwives carried their own versions, learning by apprenticeship and the silent approval of the women who had taught them. The medicine served many hands: the physician's pen, the apothecary's mortar, the midwife's apron, the housewife's larder. It crossed occupational lines with an ease that indicated something deeper than mere convenience. Laudanum answered a cultural need for remedies that behaved like consolations, portable, immediate, and, importantly, quiet. All this made the tincture a fluid actor in the politics of pain. The early modern physician, observant, practical, and often reliant upon symptomatic relief, saw laudanum as a tool in the box. To the apothecary, laudanum was a commodity of trust. To the midwife, laudanum was a means to manage labour's noise and irregularity. To the housewife, it was an ingredient in the small economies of comfort that kept households functioning. The tincture's variability, its many personalities, made it adaptable to you. It could be used sparingly and reverently. It could be used immoderately as a folk remedy where pain or grief needed to be numbed without ceremony. It supplied a private relief for public hardships. By the time the 19th century dawned and the Industrial Revolution reshaped the map of Britain and its empire, laudanum was no longer just an alchemical curiosity or a physician's convenience. It had become, in an unremarkable way, a domestic staple. The Victorian household, between 1837 and 1901, the setting that bore the era's contradictions, kept laudanum on bedside tables, in kitchen cupboards beneath jars of pickles and sugar, and in the satchels of midwives. Chemists across cities such as London, Manchester and Edinburgh printed price lists that included laudanum. Small shop proprietors and rising chains alike stocked bottles with demure paper labels. The foundation of retail chemists, Boots in Nottingham in 1849 among them, occurred in this environment, and whether one speaks of the urban shop or the rural dispenser, the pattern was the same. Laudanum was sold readily, often without the burdensome formalities of modern prescriptions, because it had been normalised as cure and comfort for generations. Industrial injury supplied much of the demand. The new factories and mines folded bodies into machines for hours that in any earlier age would have been unthinkable. Limbs were crushed in belts and gearing, muscles worked raw, and lungs laden with textile fibres and coal dust. Tuberculosis, consumption, eroded the quiet dignity of breadwinners. Neuralgia and chronic rheumatism gnawed at stoic muscles. For these injuries and ailments, laudanum provided an expedient solution, a transportable chemical hush that softened pain enough to keep men returning to the loom or to the coalface. Laudanum's utility here was not merely analgesic, it preserved livelihoods. A half-spoonful in a pocket flask could mean the difference between 5 more hours of labour and the loss of a day's wages. It was, in the calculus of working life, both a palliative and a pragmatic accommodation to an industrial order that prized steady production above bodily integrity. The remedy fit the machine. Across class lines, the tincture performed different social chores. Among factory hands and agricultural labourers, it was practical, the tired man's private tonic. Among the respectable middle classes, it was a management of sentiment. Victorian culture prized reserve, a managed sensibility that admired stoicism. The social grammar of the age required that grief be dignified and pain be endured. Laudanum provided an etiquette-compliant escape. One could sip a measured dose behind a fan or beneath the shadow of a curtain and emerge calm, composed, and socially presentable. In parlours where a sob would have been considered disproportionate, a tincture permitted grief to be muted rather than flaunted. The remedy's discretion, no smoke, no public spectacle, made it congenial to a society determined to look measured even in distress. Midwives lived at the centre of laudanum's domestic geography. They carried it to births and to bedside deaths, and they used it in the delicate management of labour pains, after pains, and postpartum anxiety. Before medical anaesthesia took hold, laudanum was one of the few reliable sedatives available to women. It calmed uterine contractions, quieted a screaming infant, and eased the jagged edges of exhaustion. That meant it was present at the most intimate thresholds of life. In the small, crowded parlours of working-class homes, midwives' apothecaries were as essential as they were prudent. A midwife's vial could calm a labouring mother enough to spare the household scandal of public distress. That was part of the tincture's Victorian success. It soothed not only nerves and bruised tissues, but also social anxieties about propriety. For a society that cherished decorum, laudanum was a discreet anaesthetic for the soul. Patent medicines made laudanum ubiquitous. The 19th century saw an explosion in commercialised remedies, cough syrups, bitters, soporifics, many of which contained opiate derivatives. Advertisements in broadsheets promised respite from sleeplessness, coughs and nerves. The language was often theatrical, the dose unregulated. In the United States, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, first marketed in the 1840s, would become notorious for being laced with morphine and marketed to mothers to calm infants. It was a model of 19th century marketing, a domestic salvation sold in syrup form with a smiling heroine on the label. In Britain and across the empire, similar concoctions circulated, their trade networks lubricated by the vast logistics of global opium distribution. Opium grown in India, where the East India Company had long organised production and export, moved through shipping lanes to London's docks, and from there into jars and bottles. Laudanum was therefore not merely a domestic custom, it was a commodity bound to imperial trade, dependent on the relations between colony and metropole. The chemistry of the 19th century complicated laudanum's identity. In 1804, Friedrich Saturnier isolated morphine from opium, and that moment recast what opium could mean in the hands of modern medicine. Morphine offered a concentrated, pure alkaloid, the later invention of subcutaneous injection in the middle of the century, with Alexander Wood popularising a practical hypodermic syringe in the 1850s, made potent opiates available in ways that tinctures had not envisaged. Yet laudanum endured. Its appeal was partly practical, liquid, transportable, easily dosed, and partly cultural. It carried a familiar social grammar, a palette of taste and an invisible sanction. It was also cheaper and simpler to make than purified alkaloids, and therefore remained the medicine of choice for many households and many apothecaries who preferred a tried, old tincture to a newer science still finding its social footing. Recognition of the opium habit grew in the 19th century, but not quickly enough to stop laudanum's ubiquity. The English phrase the opium habit appears with increasing regularity in medical journals and in parliamentary debates. Physicians and social reformers both began to note that laudanum could create dependency, and that children were at risk when mothers, for the sake of a quiet evening, administered sedative syrups without appreciating the potency. The result was a rising tension between medical acceptance and social alarm. Laudanum had for generations been both a medicine and a social lubricant, but the scale of its use made the problems visible. The recognition was partial. In professional circles there was a growing anxiety about habitual use. Among the poor it was often an unavoidable coping strategy. Social reformers worried, moralists scolded, and apothecaries adjusted their practices. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 in Britain, for example, sought to regulate the sale of poisons and medicines more strictly, insisting upon registered pharmacists and more careful record-keeping. The measure did not close laudanum's cabinet door, but it pushed the dispensing of strong remedies into a slightly more controlled space, registering the state's awareness that opiate consumption had reached a scale that required governance. Scale is an important word here. Laudanum was not an obscure indulgence. It saturated the social fabric. In a London chemist's ledger of the mid-19th century, one can imagine dozens of bottles bought in a year simply to blunt the small traumas of life. Teething, sleeplessness, postnatal exhaustion, chronic coughs that never quite left the lungs of men who had spent decades inhaling textile dust. The tincture was a logistics problem as much as a pharmacological one. Where to source reliable opium, how to price a bottle so that a family could afford it, how to label and dose it so as not to create immediate scandal. Apothecaries became logistic managers, balancing market demand with variable supplies from the eastern trade corridors. The laudanum bottle, in this sense, was a node in a broader imperial network. The opium fields, the ships that carried black chests across oceans, the warehouses on the Thames, the apothecary's shop, the midwife's pocket. These were stages in a supply chain that turned a plant into a domestic consolation. There was, too, a cultural choreography around laudanum. Writers and artists both documented and mythologized its presence. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, 1772 to 1834, whose opium habit is well known, and Thomas de Quincey, 1785 to 1859, whose Confessions of an English Opium Eater, first published in 1821, made opiate experience a subject of public fascination, gave literary shape to the tincture's double life as cure and narcotic. De Quincey's pages describe both the pleasures and terrors of opium, and cast laudanum as a gateway into other states of mind, an idea that mixed uneasily with its domestic role. Novels and newspapers repeated stories, sometimes sympathetic, sometimes carping, of the respectable addict, the grieving mother who could not rise from her lamplit couch without her tincture, the artisan who kept a flask in his pouch. The narratives mattered because they shaped expectations and anxieties. Laudanum was at once a celebrated comfort and a private scandal. And yet, for all the rhetoric, the tincture's social acceptance persisted because it fit the strategic needs of a society that demanded endurance and productivity while offering few other remedies. Laudanum was a chemical accommodation to structural problems, poor workplace safety, inadequate public health, and the relentless pace of industrial work. It was a private answer to public deserts. If a mill owner could not be expected to slow the loom, a tincture could keep the worker going. If a household could not afford a physician's constant attention, a bottle on the ledge might, for a modest sum, stand in for professional care. The remedy thus performed a logistical function as much as a therapeutic one, smoothing the frictions of an era that prized order and continuity. There is a final, softer note that belongs to the tincture's domestic life. If one closes the eyes and imagines a Victorian bedtime, the scene is not all gloom. There is the warm weight of a child, the smell of baking, a woman's hand smoothing a man's shoulder, a gentle clink as a small spoon meets a glass bottle. In that movement, so ordinary, so intimate, laudanum was often simply a means to maintain the household rhythm. It was a small, durable technology of comfort, no more romantic and no less necessary than the kettle or the lamp. And like those things, it could be used wisely or abused. The difference lay in scale and in the social tolerance that allowed a medicinal practice to become a habitual refuge. Laudanum's history, therefore, is not only a history of chemistry or pharmacology, it is a story of how societies manage pain. In practical terms, when the pressures of labour and decorum outpace the capacity for structural remedy. If there is a wry observation to be made, that lies in the double meaning of the term itself, laudare, to praise. The name bestowed by a 16th century insurgent against the old medical order promised approval and cure. By the Victorian era, laudanum's praise was less ecclesiastical and more prosaic, praised for making people bearable in public and functional in private. It was lauded, in other words, because it allowed a society to go on. There is an irony there, a soft and dark one, that the very tincture praised for solace also became a mechanism for masking the deeper causes of human ache. In kitchens and clinics, in dockside warehouses and the darkened backrooms of apothecaries, laudanum circulated as a whispered accomplice to endurance, a remedy that soothed without confronting the harder work of structural change. It was both symptom and solution, and so the story bends through time, from Paracelsus with his alembic and his saffron, through the habiliments of apothecaries whose counters smelled of spice and spirit, into the prescriptions of Sydenham and the domestic recipe books that kept the tincture alive in family hands, and finally into Victorian life where the little brown bottle sat unobtrusively beside the teacup. A private instrument for the public performance of composure. Each stage altered laudanum's form and function, yet the thread remains the same, a chemical answer to an ancient human need for relief, folded into the logistics of trade, shaped by professional authority, woven into domestic economies, and given to the world in amber glass. It is a history of a drink that promised to hide pain, and in doing so revealed something fundamental about the societies that chose to praise it. Laudanum was an alcoholic extract of opium, a dark aromatic tincture that tasted of bitter sap and stale spirits and carried the concentrated presence of the opium poppy wherever it went. It was not a single chemical but a crowded household of alkaloids, morphine dominant among them after Friedrich Saturner's work in 1804, but also codeine and a host of lesser compounds extracted from the dried latex of Papaver somniferum. You could buy it in a chemist's shop in Whitechapel, or a grocer's window in Philadelphia. You could swallow it from a silver teaspoon in a Manchester workhouse, or breathe it in tiny measured drops from a London vial at the bedside of some fading consumptive in Malta or Calcutta. In its simplest description, it was opium dissolved in alcohol, but that description understates both its cunning and its cruelty. Alcohol was not merely solvent, it was also sedative company, a second agent whose warmth and edge made the syrup more palatable and the sedation more complete. Laudanum smelled of old brandy, of sugar boiled to a thin caramel. It explained itself as comfort. The pharmacology, as we now understand it, is neat and mechanistic, but it reads like a quiet mercilessness when you put the words next to what people were feeling. Morphine and its fellows are agonists at the opioid receptors, most importantly the Mu receptor, that stud the brain and spinal cord, the little molecular locks into which opioid keys fit. These receptors are G-Go protein-coupled switches. When an opiate turns them on, the cell's internal machinery winds down. Cyclic AMP production falls, voltage-gated calcium channels close, potassium channels open, and neurons become less likely to fire. Practically speaking, nociceptive signals, the nerve messages that tell you you're injured, that your lungs are burning with cough, that your intestines are cramping, are blunted in the spinal cord's dorsal horn and in higher centres. The cortex's appraisal of pain softens, the ascending arousal systems quiet. The result is analgesia, yes, but also sedation and a slipperiness of affect. Anxiety falls away, the world narrows, sleep comes easier because the body's alarms are muffled. That same mechanism also explains laudanum's principal risks. The brainstem houses the respiratory centres that sense carbon dioxide and drive the rhythm of breathing. Mu-opioid receptor activity turns down that drive. Sufficient doses, especially when combined with another depressant like alcohol, the automatic urge to take a deep restorative breath can dwindle to a whisper. The bowels are similarly rich in opioid receptors. Their tone slackens and transit slows so that chronic laudanum use produces a patient, almost philosophical constipation, an everyday suffering that was so ordinary in the Victorian period it was called a natural consequence of taking laudanum. Pupils constricted to pinpricks, cough reflex blunted, nausea and vomiting sometimes subdued, these were part of the pharmacological signature. Over time, the nervous system learns the presence of the drug. What once soothed now demands an ever-increasing dose to achieve the same quieting. Tolerance steps in like a polite thief, taking the analgesia and leaving dependence in its place. When the drug is withheld, the nervous system roars back. Increased pain sensitivity, yawning, lacrimation, rhinorrhea, sweating shivers, diarrhea, a constellation of withdrawal symptoms that were known to physicians and sufferers alike, often rendered in casebooks with clinical precision and sometimes with near-poetic despair. Victorian practitioners could not point to mu receptors. They had to rely on observation, on the ledger of cases, on the blunt arithmetic of outcomes, but chemistry was changing their instruments and their ambitions. Sir Turner's discovery that morphine was the active principle of opium was revolutionary because it allowed concentration. The tinctures and syrups of the early 18th century were, by virtue of crude extraction, variable in potency. The mid-19th century saw laboratories in Germany and France isolating and marketing pure alkaloids, morphine, later codeine after Pierre Robiquet's work in the 1830s, and pharmaceutical firms, whether Merck in Darmstadt or Park, Davis in Detroit, began to make medicines that behaved the same bottle after bottle. The other technological shock came with the hypodermic needle. Alexander Wood in Edinburgh and Charles Prévaz in Lyon, independently in the 1850s, produced devices that allowed drug to skip the stomach and the slow digestive passage and had arrived directly into the bloodstream. The needle made morphine immediate and intense. And immediacy meant an unprecedented pharmacological intimacy. Soldiers in the American Civil War were given morphine for wounds. When those wounds healed, many found that the drug had not left them. Soldier's disease became a phrase in US medical literature to reckon with a problem no one had anticipated on such a scale. The dangers that attached to laudanum were thus multiplicative. There was the inherent risk of respiratory depression and the slow creep into physiological dependence. There was the agony of constipation, the daily indignity of a body that would no longer move smoothly. There was tolerance's arithmetic, more and more to get less and less, and then there was the merciless variability. Laudanum as a recipe admitted tinkering. Some apothecaries in small towns made their tinctures with stronger opium loads, some with weaker, some used gin, some brandy, some plain spirits of wine, some sweetened heavily with sugar and aniseed to disguise bitterness. A mother in Leicester might give her baby a teaspoonful she had measured herself. An infirm elderly man in a Liverpool boarding house might receive a draught from an old wine glass. A factory foreman might take a dose at dawn and another at noon and a third at night, not always aware that the bottle in his pocket had been refilled with a stronger tincture than the last. Home mixing, the practice of adjusting, diluting or concentrating a remedy at home, was common. Laudanum's alcohol content compounded the hazard. Alcohol and opiates are synergistic central nervous system depressants. The solvent was a companion to the drug's effects, lending its own soporific force and, when drunk alongside more spirits or sedatives, producing respiratory depression by addition rather than multiplication, a deadly arithmetic quietly performed in parlours and poorhouses across an empire. The private economies of laudanum were not merely biochemical, they were commercial, intimate and enormously profitable. The mid-19th century saw the explosion of what we call the patent medicine market, a term that sounds legal and official, but which more often meant proprietary, secret and aggressively advertised. In the teeming press of London, Manchester, New York and Boston, small woodcut ads promised elixirs that would stop a cough, restore vigour to the worn-out, give sleep to the fretful child and smooth the jagged edges of a woman's nerves. Manufacturers deployed every available trick: testimonials, often fictional or exaggerated, laurel-wreathed portraits of contented families, lists of ailments supposedly cured, endorsements signed by physicians, who were sometimes nothing of the sort, and the insinuation of science through Latin phrases and chemical-sounding names. The emporia of the patent medicine trade were as much about narrative as they were about chemistry. They traded in reassurance. The phrase soothing syrup carried with it an assurance not merely of medical action, but of moral propriety. A woman whose child went to sleep had been a good mother. A husband who could work did his duty. Certain products became household names and, in so becoming banal, instruments of concealment. In Britain, Godfrey's cordial and paragric, camphorated tincture of opium, were widely used to quiet squalling infants and to soothe the elderly. In the United States, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup was an omnipresent offering in the advertising pages of family papers, a ready comfort for teething, colic, and any small domestic unease. They were sold in pretty bottles, frequently sweetened with sugar, and tinted with harmless-seeming ingredients to make them more palatable to young tongues. A midwife, a nurse, a grandmother might dispense such a syrup with no legal or medical sanction required. The chemist's counter and the travelling peddler served as parallel distribution networks. The steamship and the railway carried crates of elixir beyond the metropolis, the colonial markets of India, Australia and Canada filled with the same bottled reassurances. The scale was industrial. Labels were printed in the thousands. Engraved advertising plates circulated among regional newspapers. Agents sold by commission in street stalls and at some country fairs. A bottle of laudanum could move from a plantation in Bengal, where opium cultivation fed imperial coffers, to a chemist in London, and then find its way to a kitchen table in Devon by the end of the week. What made these cordials so commercially irresistible and socially disquieting in retrospect was the systematic obfuscation of content and risk. Ingredients were rarely disclosed. Where a label listed anything resembling content, it used euphemism: vegetable extracts, essences, old family recipes. Salesmanship leaned heavily on the notion that trained experience, not chemistry, determined cure. A remedy that had been used for generations was implicitly safer than a pill from a laboratory. The patent medicine manufacturer did not have to disclose morphine's name to sell morphine's effects. Indeed, the very secrecy of a proprietary formula became a marketing device. It suggested superior knowledge, a secret handed down rather than a public science. That secrecy made it difficult for consumers to connect cause and effect. A mother was unlikely to associate repeated doses of a soothing syrup with a child's later listlessness. A tired seamstress might credit improved performance to an evening dram rather than an increasing physiological reliance on an opiate. For the merchant, it was profitable concealment. For the user, a plausible deniability. The patent medicine economy had a human geography. Markets were targeted. Mothers and infants were a central demographic. Advertising copy of the era plays with tenderness because tenderness sells. Images of a mother holding a placid infant, the caption promising safe sleep or peaceful nights, were standard. Invalids and the chronically ill, sufferers of consumption, chronic cough, neuralgia, dyspepsia, formed another. Laudanum was so useful for suppressing the coughing fits of tuberculosis that physicians often prescribed it as a palliative. It made a night easier to bear for the consumptive, and that practical compassion made it difficult for prescribers to restrict its use even when they worried about habituation. Labourers and sailors too bought small bottles to dull fatigue and suppress pain. In the crowded boarding houses of Liverpool and the longshore taverns of Boston, laudanum might be as common as tobacco. The result was a market both broad and deep. Every rung of social ladder used laudanum in different measures for different reasons, and precisely because the market was so capacious it fed itself. Habitual users increased demand and manufacturers responded with branding, with variations and with a constant stream of advertisement promising a return to normalcy. The commercial imperatives of that market were not invisible to medical professionals, and they occasioned a moral panic in some quarters even as many doctors profited or acquiesced. The profession was not monolithic. In medical journals, in the Lancet and in the Provincial Medical and Surgical Journal in Britain, in the various state and city medical societies' proceedings in the United States, there were vigorous and often public debates about the correct use of opiates. Some practitioners, surgical and general, wrote with near-theoretical devotion about laudanum's unrivaled power as an analgesic. For severe pain, for relieving the agonies of childbirth or the sharp knives of surgical intervention before anesthesia became widespread, laudanum was praised as a gift. In a world where disease often meant unremitting suffering, a tincture that softened the edges of existence had an ethical defence. Relieve pain when you can. For palliative practitioners of mid-century, especially those dealing with consumption and malignant disease, laudanum's value was immediate and morally persuasive. It made a person comfortable, a patient less fearful in their last hours. The demand for such comfort exerted pressure on prescribers to use laudanum even where they might taste misgiving. Opponents, and there were many, marshalled other forms of evidence. They published case reports, catalogues of long-term users whose appetites, fortunes and family lives had been eroded by chronic use. They described the industrial patterns they saw: ships carrying opium and tinctures like cargoes of banality, chemists wholesaling to peddlers who sold to mothers. They pointed to the new clinical pictures brought into prominence by modern chemistry and technology. Anaesthetists and surgeons could now give concentrated morphine intravenously or subcutaneously, and with immediacy came a new class of addiction. Alexander Wood's hypodermic syringe, celebrated for its clinical precision, was also criticised for facilitating the most intimate and rapid of dependencies. The American Civil War fed that debate with 1 million wounds and a momentum of medication. Veterans returning from 1865 with morphine habituation became living proof for those who argued that medical practice could manufacture addiction. The ethical inflection of these debates is revealing. For some, the question was straightforward. Is it worse to leave someone in pain or to risk creating dependence? The 19th century answer depended on whom you asked. Surgeons and palliative physicians attuned to immediate suffering leaned toward intervention. Reformers and many public health-minded physicians worried about long-term social and moral consequences and about the public's unregulated access to powerful drugs. The notion of iatrogenesis, that medicine could itself produce harm, gained traction slowly. Some commentators, like Thomas de Quincey, who wrote his Confessions of an English Opium Eater in 1821, and thus contributed to an almost confessional popular discourse about it, opium's pleasures and perils turned public attention to the psychological and moral dimensions of opioid habit. De Quincey's book did not instruct doctors in physiology, but it forced readers and practitioners to consider the lived consequences of habitual use. How a chemical sleep could become the only shelter. Regulation was slow and halting, shaped by commercial interests and by professional divisions. In Britain, the Pharmacy Act of 1868 marked a first attempt to draw legal lines around the sale of poisons and regulated substances. It sought to bring control to sales that had been previously diffuse, registering pharmacists and limiting certain sales to qualified hands. But the Act was not a panacea. It regulated the retail of poison, but the patent medicine industry found ways to continue selling products under proprietary shields and decorative labels. On the colonial circuit, where British trade lines ran from Calcutta to Canton, decisions about opium were entangled with ideological and fiscal priorities. The Royal Commission on Opium, 1893-94, would later testify to the complexity of regulating a substance that functioned as both a revenue source and a social hazard. In the United States, federal regulation lagged until the early 20th century. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 and the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 would eventually force manufacturers to reckon publicly with ingredients and would reshape the market. But for the Victorian century, the rulebook was thin and the market thick. Professional debates about laudanum's use thus threaded clinical care with commerce and with the questions of professional identity. Some physicians saw themselves as guardians against charlatanism, defending the medical profession's reputation by condemning patent medicines and by lobbying for clearer regulation. Others, practicing in hospital wards and in private consulting rooms, wrote of the patient whose life was immeasurably eased by opiates, the woman with relentless neuralgia who could sleep for the first time in months, the palliative patient for whom cough and breathlessness were not removed but softened into tolerable space. These testimonials had rhetorical and ethical force. What the case reports did, in aggregate, was to produce an unignorable ledger. Laudanum could be a healer and a hazard. Its application required judgment, and judgment was uneven. Competing views were printed in The Lancet and the British Medical Journal, argued at medical society meetings in Edinburgh, Liverpool and New York. The debate was not abstract. It concerned who would control access to dangerous drugs, and what trade-offs society would accept between immediate relief and long-term harm. There were, inevitably, scandals and hypocrisies. Some physicians were addicted themselves. Those stories, a doctor discreet about his own dependence, or a surgeon who became habituated after prolonged use, passed into anecdote and into the public imagination as evidence of the profession's vulnerability. William Halstead's later troubles with cocaine and morphine, at the end of the century in America, would become emblematic of the ways medical curiosity, experimental zeal, and the available pharmacopoeia could snare even the learned. Within hospitals, Nascent rules about who could prescribe and who could possess certain preparations emerged unevenly, shaped less by uniform policy than by the prudence or laxity of hospital chiefs. The medical journals themselves became arenas of struggle. Editorials and letters exchanged there have the peculiar flavour of Victorian moral reasoning married to clinical detail. A clinician would publish a case of prolonged laudanum use among a seamstress and sign off with an appeal for restraint. A manufacturer would run advertisements adjacent to critiques of patent medicines, offering an implicit rebuke to the medical profession's purity. The contradiction was never far from plain sight. The same journals that cautioned against over-the-counter laudanum published receipts and recipes recommending opiate tinctures for this or that complaint. Medicine at the time was a field negotiating the boundaries of professional authority, even as chemical technology and market forces expanded what medicine could offer. And so the story of laudanum's Victorian life is one of repeated bargains. Trade and empire made opium's alkaloids more abundant and cheaper. Chemistry made them purer and more powerful. Technology, the syringe, the printing press, the railroad, made them swift and ubiquitous. Commerce cloaked its effects. A smiling advertisement hid a bottle's potential to quiet, to dull, to destroy. Practice and conscience collided in the consulting rooms and in the letters to editors. Physicians had to choose, often in private, where to place the patient's immediate comfort against future dependence. Public authorities had to decide whether to trust the market or to restrain it. The result was a century in which laudanum was simultaneously medicine and commodity, solace and snare, a small amber bottle on a mantelshelf and a factor in the slow attrition of certain lives. If there is a single image that recurs in the medical records and the advertisements of the period, it is the silver teaspoon, glinting in lamplight, tipped toward an infant's lips or toward the cold mouth of an invalid. It is a modest domestic instrument of arithmetic, 1 teaspoon here, another later, and the ledger of doses accumulates quietly in the body. The pharmacology explains the physiology, the market organises distribution, the profession argues its ethics, and in the spaces between all three, people took laudanum for reasons sometimes practical, sometimes despairing, sometimes habit. By the time the Victorian era gave way to the Edwardian, public and professional impatience with secret remedies had increased. Chemistry had continued to refine drug identification, and the first tentative steps toward regulation and disclosure were in hand. But the middle decades, the 1840s through the 1870s especially, were an age in which laudanum did what all good drugs do, and what all dangerous drugs also do. It relieved, it rewarded, and it exacted a price that was often easy to miss until the bill came due. On a little walnut table in a middling parlour, between a hymn book and a vase of slightly bowed roses, a small cork-stopped bottle of laudanum kept its patient amber watch. Its label might be handwritten by a country apothecary or printed by a respectable London house. It might be anonymous and much used, or it might bear the proud imprimatur of a famous manufacturer. Either way, it was never far from a hand that trembled or a heart that ached. For much of the 19th century in England, Scotland, Ireland, and across the Atlantic in America, the culture of medicine and the culture of domestic life braided together until laudanum, tincture of opium, a remedy with a pedigree stretching back to Paracelsus, became as ordinary as tea. It soothed, it quieted, it promised to staunch the jagged edges of experience labelled, with a gentle and ever-expanding vocabulary, nerves. The word nerves in that long century was a pillow into which many anxieties were tucked. It could mean a headache, a faintness, a suite of melancholic ruminations, a throb of moral dread, a physiological claim that the nervous system had been taxed by the modern world. Physicians, midwives, husbands, and friends spoke of nerves in tones that mixed scientific seriousness, moral instruction, and domestic affection. In the hands of a doctor, it was medical language. In the mouths of neighbours, it was a coded social judgment. She is nervous, she is delicate. She cannot do what is expected. Into that vocabulary slid the old diagnosis of hysteria, whose etymology carried the stifled accusation that the uterus itself had wandered into the mind, and the more modern coinage neurasthenia, announced to the English-speaking world by the American neurologist George Miller Beard in 1869, to describe a new epidemic of nervous exhaustion, thought to afflict those strained by urban life and industrial demands. In Paris, Jean-Martin Charcot staged hysteria as spectacle at the Salpêtrière in the 1880s. In his amphitheatre, women writhed and fainted beneath the eyes of medical men, and the spectacle rippled back into British consulting rooms and the pages of transnational medical journals. Freud, a young Viennese, came to Paris in 1885 to learn from Charcot, carrying home forms of thought that would alter the language of desire, suffering, and diagnosis. The names and dates line up like markers along a route one can trace. Beard's neurasthenia in 1869, Charcot's public lessons in the 1880s, Freud's Paris visit in 1885. They are waypoints in the path by which female feeling became an object to be read, labelled, treated, and, to many practitioners, soothed. Soothing was, in the Victorian medical imagination, a virtue and a duty. If a woman presented with nervous complaints, wild palpitation after bereavement, sleeplessness after childbirth, flushing and fainting at the social demands of a dinner, periodic paroxysms the doctor could only call hysterical, there were a limited set of therapeutic gestures available. Some physicians recommended rest, control of the imagination, regimen, alteration of diet. Others suggested mechanical manipulation, electrical devices, or the notorious rest cure popularized by the American physician Silas Weir Mitchell in the 1870s and 1880s, which prescribed enforced seclusion and curtails of creative activity for women diagnosed with nervous disorders. Mitchell's prescriptions became part of the cultural legend of the male doctor who knows best, so well satirized in Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper of 1892, and they exemplified a certain paternalism that assumed women's minds were fragile instruments to be protected from themselves. Into that clinical paternalism walked Laudanum, unobtrusive and obliging. A few drops could still the agitation, bring sleep, blunt the teeth of grief for an afternoon, even dull the phantom pains of a uterus supposed to be hypochondriacal. Midwives, who in the countryside and among the poor were the main repositories of reproductive and postpartum care, treated the practical business of labour and the intimate business of female suffering with what was at hand. For matters of childbirth, for the violent cramping of afterpains, for the fevers and hemorrhoids that trailed deliveries, for the raw exhaustion of a mother in a room without servants and without hot water, Laudanum had the virtues practitioners most prized. It was cheap, it worked quickly, and it could be administered without the prolonged apparatus or specialist knowledge that, say, chloroform or ether required. In urban hospitals and at the court, anaesthetics were beginning to change the conduct of labour. John Snow famously administered chloroform to Queen Victoria during the birth of Prince Leopold in 1853, so that the notice of a monarch might normalise the use of analgesia. But for ordinary women, the tincture remained the domestic anaesthetic par excellence. It was poured into teas, folded into cakes, mixed with port, dropped into a spoon of milk at night, added to adhesive plasters applied to the belly. Midwives recommended it not as a point of doctrine but as practical consolation. Make the mother sleep, and the house will survive. Wakeful, she cannot care for the baby, prepare the broth, or get herself up the stairs. That laudanum was also a tool of medical paternalism suited the temper of a society that expected women to be both devout and delicate. If nerves were read as a sign of sensitivity, moral sensitivity, emotional refinement, then the drug that calmed those nerves could be presented as preserving a woman's proper role. There is an irony in that the same pharmacology that was used to efface women's suffering was read by some moralists as evidence of their weakness. If a man took laudanum to dull the sting of a wound, or to sleep off the horrors of industrial labour, he was doing the rational thing. If a woman took it because her husband or doctor advised it, she was vulnerable to vice. Sensibility and sin wore the same face. The language of weakness became a moral matrix. Physicians who argued for treatment did so partly from compassion and partly on behalf of social order. These interventions, in their small domestic acts of quieting, were also acts of governance. Dependence crept in the wake of this governance like a shadow following a familiar gait. Laudanum was a tincture whose potency varied from bottle to bottle. Apothecaries compounded it in different strengths, and household recipes, herbalists, female relatives, pragmatic midwives mixed in port, rosemary, sugar, and sometimes more opium than a novice might intend. A doctor's prescription might be measured in grains and drops, but from the patient's bedside the language was different. A teaspoonful to still a baby, 2 drops beneath the tongue to sleep through the night, a spoon now and then to still the accusatory voice of grief when the house was empty or the husband at the club. Somewhere between chemistry and affection, doses escalated. Women learned to self-medicate, often in secret. The social hush around female pain, keep your composure, pull yourself together, meant that a woman's labour with laudanum became a private negotiation, rarely taxed by the public. There were other mechanisms that pushed women toward opiate dependence. Medicines marketed specifically to women multiplied in the 19th century, promising to remedy menstrual irregularities, female weakness, and moral decay. These female tonics were often elaborately packaged and scented, anointing the commodities of domestic medicine with the patina of science. An apothecary's sign, a neat metal case labelled in copperplate, sufficed to resolve a mother's embarrassment. Middle-class magazines printed testimonials and anxiously circumspect advice columns. Doctors endorsed, or at least did not oppose, mild narcotics as temporary salves. And because there were few reliable alternatives for chronic anxiety and depression, no electrical shock therapy as a standardized practice, no psychotropic classes yet developed, doctors were pragmatic. The clinician of the 1850s or 1870s who offered laudanum was not always callous or corrupt. He, and it was usually he, believed he was ameliorating suffering. But the social scripts that made female frailty a thing to be managed, rather than an injustice to be challenged, ensured that a pharmacological palliative could calcify into a social habit. The stories that press columnists and moralists loved to tell turned such dependencies into cautionary tales. A wife who became regularly slothful, disengaged from worship or household duty, who seemed faintly disordered at family gatherings, would be read as having let a tincture supplant her moral backbone. In courtrooms and coroner's inquests, laudanum appeared as evidence of either desperation or moral failure. Men insisted that a woman's use of laudanum betrayed her inability to be a centre of moral firmness. Women's advocates argued that it was the absence of social and economic support that drove mothers into the arms of a bottle. At the intersection of class and gender, this was stark. An aristocratic woman had a physician and a nurse. A labouring mother had an apothecary and a midwife and sometimes a bottle she purchased herself. Both could be trapped. And the habit of using laudanum for what were essentially social injuries had consequences that rippled out from the personal into the public. Children were soothed into sedation. Mothers had less stamina for labour and infant care. Households came to revere an inarticulate quiet. This last, quiet, was elevated as a virtue. In sermons and etiquette manuals, to be quiet signalled respectability. Yet silence could, under the azure light of the night lamp where laudanum glimmered, also mean dulling of sensation that left a woman's life flattened to manageable contours. It is one thing to prescribe a night's rest for recovery. It is another to train generations to outsource feeling. Victorian narratives of gender, woman as angel of the house or as moral weakling, were nourished by this pharmacology. Laudanum became a material interpreter of what it meant to be female. Always available, always gentle, sometimes recommended, sometimes condemned. The domestic ubiquity of laudanum carried with it a smaller, brighter horror that is easy to imagine at a bedside lamp. Infants soothed into anaesthetised sleep. If mothers were told to keep their babies quiet, and if colic and inconsolable crying could be fixed by a cordial sold by the apothecary, then the temptation to reach for a measured draught was great. In the nursery, under the same lamplight as the mother's remedies, a jar of Godfrey's cordial might sit on a shelf next to a tin of arrowroot. Godfrey's cordial had a long life in British and colonial households across the 18th and 19th centuries. It was sweet, viscous, and laced with opium. Across the Atlantic, American mothers could buy Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, an immensely popular patent medicine of the mid-19th century, whose advertising promised relief for teething colic and sleepless nights, and which, like many such syrups, contained morphine or opium derivatives and often alcohol. The logic of these products was merciless in its simplicity. Soothe the child, quiet a house. The logic of their markets read parental fear as a resource to be commodified. Patent medicines were sold as cure-alls, the maker's name and a sentimental image, an obliging nurse, a sober nursemaid, provided a veneer of trust. Advertising in the mid-1800s became sophisticated. Ads appeared in newspapers, broadsheets, and on trade cards, promising that a bottle would buy sleep and, with it, moral rectitude and a mother's sanity. For a frazzled parent, the soothing syrup was an answer to the impossible expectations of caregiving. What followed was, at times, tragic and at times fatally banal. The pharmacology of opiates in infants is unforgiving. Even small doses depress a child's respiration and can lead to coma and death. Coroners' reports in provincial England and in American cities periodically recorded the presence of opiates in infants' stomachs. Newspapers seized upon these inquests with a merciless appetite. Particulars of a weeping mother, a half-emptied bottle, the physician's statement that the child's death was caused by accidental poisoning. Press coverage did two things at once. It heightened public anxiety, and it fed the impression that mothers were morally culpable. The verdicts were often ambiguous. Was the mother an unwitting beneficiary of a stimulant marketed to soothe, or was she a negligent parent? The courts and coroners were left to pass the difference, and their findings fed larger debates about regulation. Children's deaths associated with opiate cordials were not only accidental. The darker scandals of the era, annals of baby farming, and the criminal neglect of infants in urban anonymity sometimes used laudanum as a ready, cheap, and effective agent of murder. Baby farming had a brutal logic. Where a child was entrusted to a caregiver for a fee, the cheapest way to avoid the cost of feeding was quieting the child permanently. The revelations that surfaced in late Victorian Britain, culminating in sensational trials in the 1880s and 1890s, fed public revulsion. While not every case of baby farming relied upon laudanum, some were cases of starvation or blunt violence, many of the infamous prosecutions found opiates in the systems of murdered infants. The shocking details, babies wrapped in newspapers, ledger books kept of payments, bottles with a few drops of amber liquid left, entered the popular imagination and hardened resolve that something must be done. Campaigns for reform followed, propelled as much by compassionate philanthropists as by the indignation of the middle-class moral crusaders. Charities and newly founded organisations such as the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children in Britain, founded in 1884, made the protection of children a public issue. Newspapers and medical journals, the Lancet, the British Medical Journal, and a bevy of provincial papers, published exposés and empirical studies that laid out the risk of unlabelled opiates in domestic remedies and infant syrups. Coroners' reports were compiled into dossiers. In legislative chambers, the quiet work of regulation began. The British Pharmacy Act of 1868 had already signalled a desire to control the sale of certain poisons and to professionalise dispensing, but it left gaps that patent medicines exploited. Later lines of regulation, the Sale of Food and Drugs Act of 1875 and amendments thereafter, began to require more accountability, and public pressure eventually pushed toward clearer labelling and controls, though the moves were incremental and resisted by entrenched commercial interests. Across the Atlantic, the American trajectory echoed this pattern. Patent medicines flourished in the United States in the 19th century. Their sales were gigantic. Mothers bought them because they were effective in the short term and because the market had long since learned to sell consolation as a commodity. It was not until the early 20th century that federal regulations like the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 began to require ingredient labelling for proprietary medicines, and later, the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 would bring opiates into a framework of national control. Between the nursery and the courtroom, however, the dead infants remained testimony to a century that had blurred the line between care and commerce. The public anxiety that the press fomented had two faces. On one side there was righteous horror, a desire to protect the weak and to punish the guilty, to regulate the medicines that preyed on parental fear. On the other side there was unease about the social fault lines that made mothers vulnerable. Poverty, lack of education, the precariousness of single women or domestic servants. The finger of blame, when it came, often landed on mothers as if their private acts were grotesque breaches in the moral economy of the household. Yet the truth was more structural. The market had discovered a demand and supplied it. Doctors, midwives, and apothecaries had become tacit partners in a culture that rendered pharmacology normal. The reforms that followed, labelling, restrictions, and public health campaigns, were at once necessary and belated. If laudanum was a domestic narcotic and a public problem, it was also an aesthetic. The tincture crossed the threshold from medicine to muse, with a quiet theatricality that authors and artists could not ignore. Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater arrived in the literary world in 1821 and altered the tone in which narcotics were discussed. He wrote with candour and with an exotic savour about the pleasures of opium and about the slow, sweet descent into a dependence that mixed pain and rapture. De Quincey's prose is itself opiate-like. Sentences nestings within sentences, images that burn gently then fade. His confessional narrative transformed the opium eater into a recognisable figure, the solitary consumptive genius, the man who reaches out for a bottle and finds, in its glass, a corridor into expanded perception. De Quincey foregrounded the paradox of opium as both stimulant and destroyer. His influence was immediate and far-reaching, picked up not only among English romantic circles but across Europe. Samuel Taylor Coleridge was among those whose work and life came to be read through the lens of opium. Coleridge used laudanum over decades. His opium use is documented in letters and medical prescriptions and has been woven into the critical histories of works like Kubla Khan and The Pains of Sleep. Kubla Khan, an image of rapturous interruptions and visionary architecture, was supposedly composed in 1877 during an opium-induced reverie, and later, in 1816, printed with the caveat of its dream origin. Coleridge's capacity to conjure luminous images of caverns, river music, and decreed pleasure has often been tied, in popular accounts and critical essays, to the altered states he experienced. He was neither wholly celebrated nor wholly damned. Rather, his life became a key test case in the debate over whether chemical stimulation could augment genius or whether it eroded the faculties from which genius drew sustenance. His late inability to sustain creative production, attributed by many to prolonged opiate use, became a cautionary example. Across the Channel, Charles Baudelaire, the French poet and critic, read English opium literature and responded with his own investigations. Les Paradis Artificiels, published in 1860, owes a debt to De Quincey and to the Romantic tradition. Baudelaire wrote with clinical lyricism about hashish and opium, cataloguing both the intoxication and its aftershocks. He approached the topic not as a mere journalist might, but as an observer who could map the aesthetic effects of narcotics, the intensification of sensation, the opening of associative chains, the complex pleasure of perceiving colour and time differently. Yet Baudelaire's tone was never uncritical. He remarked on the cheapness of certain pleasures, on the way artificial paradises could exhaust the soul as surely as they elevated the senses. The opium aesthetic thus operated on two planes. On one plane it was a vocabulary for altered perception, the synesthesia of colours with sound, the vertiginous recombination of memory and fantasy, the sensation of amplitude in a formerly narrow life. On the other plane it was an emblem of modernity, the artist who sought in chemistry what industrial life had denied them: depth, plenitude. Scape. Writers and painters imagined opium as an engine for new vision. It inspired poems, narratives, and images that attempted to represent states of consciousness otherwise unavailable. But those same works also contributed to the myth that intoxication equaled inspiration, and in doing so they made for seductive but dangerous models. A reader encountering De Quincey's dexterous sentences might both admire and emulate. The emulation sometimes ended with dependence and ruin. The aestheticization of opiates could also be darkly commercial. Publishers learned to package confessions and elisions. The opium addict became a recognizable selling point. The cultural appetite for stories of visionary intoxication produced a feedback loop. Literary production romanticized drug use, and that romanticization fed new consumption patterns. In London, the exoticized image of the opium den, complete with Chinese gardeners and oriental rugs, joined the domestic image of the laudanum bottle at the bedside. Limehouse and Soho opera houses staged scenes of oriental decadence. The opium den became a symbol in detective fiction and sensation novels. Yet the opium den was a social fact too. Small dens serving mostly working men and some women existed in the city and in ports, and their existence shaped fantasies about empire, race and vice. Domestic laudanum and the opium den, though different in social register, were contiguous in the cultural imagination. Artistic communities wrestled with the contradictions. Some painters and poets, symbolists such as Gustave Moreau and later figures in the fin de siècle, used opiate imagery to speak of poetic illumination. Others, wary of the moral and physiological costs, wrote elegies for ruined talent. The critical conversation shifted as medical science added weight to the cautionary tale. Physiologists and psychiatrists measured the mind's responses, catalogued the cycles of tolerance and withdrawal, and argued that the narcotic could not be the source of sustained creative production. Henry Maudsley and British psychiatrists of the late 19th century argued, in their own registers, that addiction led to degeneracy rather than creative endurance. The debate thus moved from a romantic celebration to a modern scepticism. The cultural residue of the Laudanum muse remains double-edged. In one telling, we see how chemical means opened new cognitive corridors. In another, we observe the human cost of an economy that fused private solace with commercial profit. De Quincey's beautiful sentences and Coleridge's luminous images left a heritage that artists continued to mine. But the stories of mothers in nursery alcoves and of young poets losing their faculties also remind us that the same tincture eased pain at the cost of agency. Laudanum's presence in the Victorian imaginary, woman tranquilized in her parlour, infant quieted for a dangerous sleep, opium den as stage, maps not just a pharmacological history, but a moral geography in which gender, class, and art collided. If one were to walk through 19th century Britain or America with a lamp and a ledger, one could plot the trade routes of dependency with a surprising intimacy. A city chemist in Bristol listing tinctures sold by the bottle, a main grocer supplying misses. Winslow's cordial to a rural postmistress who then shipped parcels to neighbours, a midwife in Lancashire keeping a small stock of laudanum in her black medical chest, a Parisian lecture hall where hysteria was demonstrated. These are logistical facts, supply, distribution, marketing, that give the moral and cultural narratives their scale. Opiates were not only objects of private consolation, but commodities of mass circulation. That industrial framework made the medical and the moral intersect. Networks of commerce exported a soothing that the culture needed and exploited. By the end of the century, these entanglements between gendered medicine, infant endangerment, and an opiate aesthetic began to be interrogated in more systematic ways. Campaigns for labelling and restrictions increasingly pressed governments to act. The medical profession itself divided, with some practitioners warning against liberal opiate use and others defending its therapeutic role. Women physicians, whose numbers had slowly increased through the later decades, Elizabeth Blackwell in the United States had earned her MD in 1849. Women like Mary Putnam Jacobi were arguing for scientifically rigorous attention to women's health, began to question practices that had been controlled by male clinicians, and to offer alternative models of care. Feminist critiques in the last decades of the century started to challenge the assumption that women's complaints were necessarily fragile or trivial. In doing so, they complicated the simplistic narratives that had justified laudanum's ubiquity. And yet the tincture's traces persisted. In literature that continued to draw its metaphors from the opiate aesthetic, in nursing manuals that still advised women on dosages, in apothecary ledgers that recorded sales, in the quiet lamplight where a hand might reach for a bottle. The story of laudanum in the 19th century is a story of converging economies, medical, domestic, and literary. It is a story of how a single substance could take on multiple social roles: balm, agent of commerce, artistic stimulant, and instrument of control. It is a story that asks us to think about the ways in which suffering is managed, who manages it, and what is lost in the attempt to make life tolerable. So when you picture that little bottle on its walnut table, know that it occupied many lives. It soothed mothers who had nothing else, and also dulled mothers who might have spoken up for themselves. It quieted infants and sometimes silenced them forever. It opened minds and sometimes shuttered them. The Victorian world moved forward with all of these contradictions in its pockets: benevolence and paternalism, commerce and charity, art and ruin, each held up by a single, small amber glass full of tincture, carrying within its modest circumference a history of comfort and coercion, of a muse and miasma. They began, as habits often do, at the bedside, a small thick glass bottle with a dark cork, a ribbon of sticky amber around the neck, a teaspoon parked beside it like a little boat. The smell, if there was any, was mostly the thin, warm sweetness of alcohol and the faint, anonymous bitterness of concentrated plant matter. You inhaled, and nothing screamed. You tasted it, and the world softened. In parlours and sick rooms across Britain, in the huts of soldiers on campaign, in the cottages of Lancashire, in the drawing rooms of Bloomsbury, and in the shipping wards of Calcutta, that same bottle lived for a generation of people who wanted quiet. For some it gave quiet, for others it carried them into new needs. By the second and third decades of the 19th century, that quiet was beginning to speak back. The accounts that gave the habit its public voice were literary as much as clinical. Thomas de Quincey, who first put the private geography of dependence on paper in Confessions of an English Opium Eater, published serially in 1821 and consolidated in the 1820s, described with a frankness and lyricism that troubled readers how the tincture of opium eased his pain and then required more and more to do so. De Quincey named a truth the doctors were still circling, that the body remembers and then insists. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, whose laudanum use cast long shadows over romantic circles, became living evidence that addiction cut across class. Poets, philosophers, magistrates and housemaids could alike find themselves tethered to a medicine that had in many cases been prescribed to soothe life's ordinary torments. Medicine did not at first have a neat vocabulary for the experience. Physicians in the early century preferred terms like habit or habituation, words that made dependence sound like a persistent preference rather than an altered physiology. As the century wore on, however, these words tightened into more clinical phrases: morphinism, opium habit, narcotism. Clinicians in Edinburgh and London recorded the same pattern in careful case notes. Patients who had been given tincture for pain, insomnia or nervous symptoms returned with increasing tolerance, the familiar complaint that an earlier dose no longer did the work, and then with withdrawal a constellation of unease, tremor, anorexia, diarrhea, rage and wakefulness that arrived not because the world had changed, but because the body had been reorganized around absence. The language shifted from moral judgment to physiological description. It was a small revolution in technique and a large adjustment in sympathy. Those reports were not confined to elite salons. The Civil War in the United States gave the problem extraordinary scale and new language. Surgeons treated tens of thousands of wounded men with morphine, the purified alkaloid whose isolation by Friedrich Saturner around 1804 had changed the chemistry of opium, and came home to civilians who had watched mates given morphine for shattered limbs sleeping away stronger and then needing more. After 1865, newspapers and medical journals began to use the blunt phrase soldier's disease for the dependence that many veterans carried back from battlefields. It was not an Aristotelian vice that lived only in the low and the licentious. It was a wound left by a medical technique itself. The nurse who soothed an infant's cough, the ship's surgeon who dared not let a fevered man cry, the governess made solitary by long hours, the widow with chronic pain, the miner whose hands ached at dusk, all were found on the same spectrum. Addiction did not respect the line between respectability and ruin. It threaded through occupations and houses of worship alike. Physicians and chemists watched the pattern and tinkered at remedies. The hypodermic needle, introduced to medical practice by Alexander Wood in Edinburgh in 1853 and popularised in London by advocates such as Charles Hunter, rewired dependency in two ways at once. It concentrated morphine's effect, shortening the road from prescription to powerful fix, and it forced doctors to develop responses. Some clinicians argued for abrupt cessation, an old remedy in the moralist handbook of hardening a patient's character, while others pioneered gradual reduction, a slow withdrawal in which dosages were diminished over days or weeks, sometimes substituted with weaker opiates or with tonics and stimulants. There was no consensus and good reason for that. Physiology had been described but not explained. The receptor theory that would make sense of tolerance lay a century in the future. For Victorian doctors, the work was empirical and stubborn. Observe, adapt, report. Public discourse reflected the mixture of sympathy and scorn. Weekly journals and pamphleteers in Britain and America judged laudanum use through two prisms. Clergymen and moralists denounced it as a moral failing when they could. They called it escapism when they could not fit it into sermons about temperance and self-control. Editors used the term drug fiend in headlines, as if a few hardened images could contain a clinical reality. At the same time, medical periodicals such as The Lancet and the British Medical Journal carried cautious case studies that insisted on nuance. Some patients were victims of well-meaning overprescription. Others had slipped into dependence through war wounds or chronic disease. Some were experimenting with euphoria. The effect of this authoritative public language was practical and slow. Police and courts treated many cases of habitual use as moral failings, while coroners' courts and sanitary boards began, by degrees, to register dependence as a public problem requiring systemic thinking. That shift was not merely rhetorical. Local health authorities, particularly in industrial towns, began to note patterns of chronic opiate use in their poorhouses and infirmaries. Charity physicians who had once distributed laudanum as a palliative without much bureaucratic fuss now had to write case histories and flood a paper trail. Women's magazines carried advertisements for patent nostrums and laudanum-containing preparations. The very visibility of the drug in domestic spaces made it an object of scrutiny. The baby farming scandals that erupted in the 1870s and 1880s made the stakes lethal. Where infant care was outsourced to strangers operating on the margins of poverty and legality, laudanum became both a tool and a weapon, given in small doses to quiet a baby that would then never wake, or withheld until death from a child whose care was too expensive. The arrests and investigations that followed, the most infamous culminating in the execution of Amelia Dyer in 1896, a case tried at the Old Bailey and chronicled for weeks in provincial papers, exposed a grim logistical truth, which is that the easy availability of the tincture supplied a dark market that moved from drawing rooms to workhouses and back again. Understanding how that logistical availability was created requires a map of imperial calculation. Laudanum is tinctured opium. Opium, by the 19th century, was a commodity grown at great scale in colonial fields. In British India, particularly in the provinces of Bengal and Bihar, and in later years in parts of central India known as Malwa, cultivation and collection of opium poppy sap was organised by a colonial apparatus that could hardly be called anything other than a fiscal device. The East India Company, having established political and fiscal control in Bengal after the battles and settlements of the 1760s, recognised early that opium could be converted into predictable revenue. By the late 18th and through the 19th century, the company regulated planting, set procurement prices, established warehouses for consolidation, and organised auctions in Calcutta that sold raw opium to private traders and to the company's own brokers for export. The scale mattered. It meant that opium could be processed into tonics and tinctures cheaply. It meant that a bottle of laudanum in a Liverpool chemist's shop was not, in practical terms, a rare or exotic object. It was the distal product of a regulated agricultural system spanning provinces and seas. Trade routes carried that opium to other markets. Many readers today will recall the shorthand of the Opium Wars, but those conflicts were symptoms of a larger economic choreography. British traders, among them William Jardine and James Matheson, Scotsmen who made and remade fortunes in the Canton trade in the 1820s and 1830s under the flag of Jardine, Matheson and Commingbung, pressed opium into the heart of Chinese consumption patterns, shipping cargoes from Calcutta loaded with the sticky raw opium that the Canton middlemen converted in part into smoking tobacco for the dens along the Pearl River. The Chinese imperial response under Lin Zexu in 1839, the confiscation and destruction of chests in Canton and Human, was an attempt to halt a market that had become both socially corrosive and fiscally dangerous for the Qing. The British response was military. The First Opium War, 1839 to 1842, and the Second, 1856 to 1860, were in part contests about the right to export and the rights of trade, but they were also about the logistics of supply. Who would be permitted to direct the flow of a commodified sedative whose demand, once created, proved stubborn? Those geopolitical episodes explain the bulk movement of raw opium to East Asian markets, but they also mattered to European and colonial domestic markets in another way. The imperial system normalised the plant as a cash crop and made its derivative medicines accessible. The cheapness of raw materials, combined with the proliferation of apothecaries and the rise of mass-printed medical manuals, meant that tincture making was a local technology an apothecary could enact in a back-shop shop. Laudanum's formulation was not uniform. Some preparations were more purified, some spiced with aromatics, some dosed by cautious hands, others poured out by busy shopkeepers, and that variability multiplied the hazard. Consumers might receive, in different bottles, doses that varied widely in concentration. A tired mother, given a teaspoon in the morning and the same again at night, could, across a few months, accumulate tolerance so slowly that neither she nor the prescribing doctor registered the transformation. This interplay of supply and professional practice had other consequences. The chemists and physicians who trafficked in tinctures were not malicious. They were part of a logistical network with routines and incentives. A physician running a practice in the East India Company's medical service knew that opium would be on the dispensary list. A ship's surgeon stocked laudanum precisely because it was compact, effective and legal to carry aboard. The company's control over opium exports also meant it touched the balance sheets of the metropolis. Opium revenue paid for administration and part of the military. It lubricated shipping lanes that fed into British industry. Thus, laudanum was not simply a medical curiosity. It was an item embedded in a political economy that relied upon the steady churn of cultivated fields, ports, and patent medicines. As addiction proliferated, and as some of that proliferation took a darker turn into suicide and homicide, the courts and coroners were pressed to give a finer account of cause. Here the story turns from volume to detail, from the logistics of supply to the forensic anatomy of proof. Laudanum's virtues, its rapid action, its lack of a sharp sensory flag like the vinegarish tang of arsenic or the metallic smell of cyanide, made it scientifically beautiful and juridically difficult. A fatal dose could appear, clinically speaking, like the end of sleep. The corpse did not speak. In the earlier decades of the century, when coroners and judges had only a handful of chemical reactions and comparative anatomy to call upon, many deaths that today might have been litigated as murders were recorded as natural or accidental, because the proof of foul intent was elusive. The field of toxicology, however, was maturing. Mathieu Orfila in France, publishing his Traité des Poisons in 1814, had already set the tone. Poisons could be understood by their chemical signatures and by their physiological effects. In Britain, Alfred Swain Taylor, the self-educated toxicologist whose lectures and manuals were authoritative across Victorian courtrooms, worked to translate those continental advances into English jurisprudence. What Orfila and Taylor had in common was a belief that chemistry and the testimony of the trained eye could carry the day in contentious trials. They cultivated methods for extracting alkaloids and for observing characteristic symptoms, and they trained a generation of coroners and Home Office pathologists to register their findings in a language acceptable to juries. But opiates were stubborn. The discovery of morphine by Sir Turner and later of codeine by Pierre-Jean Robiquet in the 1830s had given chemists the isolated molecules to aim at, but isolating morphine from the body of someone decomposing in a warm room after a shipboard voyage or a country house collapse was a hard task. The procedures required solvents, precipitation agents and controlled distillation. They were methods better suited to a well-equipped laboratory than to an inquest room. The variability of laudanum's composition, sometimes diluted with spirits or cut with other medicines sold over the counter, meant even laboratory tests required interpretation. Sometimes a corpse would show traces of opium, and the medical examiner could not say whether the concentration was within a therapeutic range or a lethal one. Sometimes the only evidence was that a widow had purchased the bottle herself and that she had previously been seen arguing with the deceased. Intent matters as much as chemistry in a court. In many such episodes, the scales of justice, lacking the precision of modern chromatography and mass spectrometry, tipped on character testimony rather than pure science. The result was a string of sensational inquests whose verdicts often hinged on the reputation of expert witnesses. The Rugeley poisoner William Palmer's trial in 1856, while chiefly concerned with strychnine, exemplified how the presence and reception of toxicological experts could shape a jury's view. In cases involving laudanum, the situation could be even thornier, because the substance was legally prescribable and commonly possessed. Defence counsel pointed to the ubiquity of laudanum bottles in homes and to ambiguous post-mortem findings. Prosecutors countered with testimony about purchases, tampered labels, and the behaviour of caretakers. Newspapers followed these theatrics avidly, printing coroners' cross-examinations in full, offering their readers both a macabre entertainment and, by steady repetition, a moral inventory of risk. There were, inevitably, notorious examples in which laudanum was the instrument and the motive simple. Child deaths discovered in the baby farming networks, like those attached to the once respectable name Amelia Dyer, forced the public to confront the domestic murder that could be executed with a teaspoon. In other instances, the tincture was the handmaiden of private despair. Women and men who had long soldiered under chronic grief or lung disease swallowed their teaspoons with a steady resolution and did not wake. In still other episodes, as medical historians have reconstructed from court records and coroners' reports, laudanum provided a convenient cover for domestic crimes that could be made to look like accidents. The mixture of the readily available and the legally prescribed had created a fog in which intent and outcome blurred. The slow improvement in chemical technique in the latter half of the century began to cut that fog. Microchemical tests for alkaloids, condensation and precipitation methods, and increasingly confident comparisons of physiologic response allowed pathologists to assert that a given decedent had, in fact, been given a lethal quantity. The development of more sensitive analytic techniques, crude by modern standards, meticulous in practice, meant courts could occasionally hang a verdict upon chemistry instead of on character alone. That shift had two consequences. One was immediate. Some would-be murderers were convicted where previously they might have been let off on reasonable doubt. The other was cultural. The public, reading of new tests and more forceful expert testimony, began to conflate laudanum with culpability in a different way than they had when it had merely been a common domestic medicine. Toxicity became not only a clinical fact, but a social fear. The legal geography of culpability was, for its part, complicated by empire and trade. The laudanum bottle in an English parlour had its provenance in fields along the Hooghly River, or in the dusty tracts of Malwa. It had been transformed on a ship, labelled in a London apothecary, and sold at a chemist's counter by a man who had little idea of the political negotiation that had made the bottle possible. The East India Company's auctions and the private merchant houses, Jardine, Matheson and their contemporaries, provided the oceanic arteries that made opium cheap enough to be tinctured in every shop. That cheapness, as we have seen, had public health consequences and legal ones. Where supply is vast and inexpensive, misuse becomes a question for systems rather than for souls. The politics of that supply were often frank. At Westminster, merchants and their allies defended the trade on free trade grounds. They argued that commercial liberty and imperial revenue were legitimate, and that the addiction seen in minority groups was not a reason to choke a legitimate market. Opponents, missionaries, moral campaigners, and increasingly some physicians, insisted that empire had created a moral hazard on a transnational scale, and that the state bore responsibility. In 1893, the British government convened a Royal Commission on Opium, a formal inquiry whose terms were political as much as scientific. The commission spent months taking testimony, reading reports and travelling. It ultimately delivered conclusions that satisfied relatively few people, but its very existence marked the recognition that the opium problem was not a set of private misadventures, but a systemic phenomenon, a matter of trade, of administration, and of health. There are ironies in that history that a bedside voice can afford to point out gently. The same networks that kept sailors alive on long voyages by allowing captains to carry effective painkillers also put effective intoxicants into the hands of those who did not need them. The same tincture that could make a woman's nights bearable on a cold Lancashire evening could, in wrong hands, become an instrument of late-night desperation. Medicine's tools were both palliative and porous. The technologies that improved life expectancy, the syringe, the purified alkaloid, shipping that could move cargo quickly and cheaply, also multiplied the pathways to dependence and to crime. The 19th century was, in that particular sense, a laboratory of modernity. We learnt to manufacture relief at scale, and in learning we discovered new risks that required a public response. By the century's end, the conversation had shifted enough to be recognisable to us. Addiction was being discussed in terms that connected individual case histories to population-level consequences. Municipal authorities in cities like London, Liverpool and Glasgow began to collect statistics. Journals printed surveys, public campaigns dressed their appeals in the language of sanitary reform as well as moral uplift. The categories of doctor and dealer blurred in the middle decades, but they were being sorted, and the law was adapting haltingly to the reality that a drug's place in commerce and empire mattered to how a society regulated its use at home. The story of laudanum is therefore, among other things, a story about scale and its consequences. To follow the tincture's path is to move from a woman's bedside in 1830s Bath to a company warehouse in Calcutta, from a surgeon's linen chest in a Virginia field hospital to an Old Bailey dock where an accused mother is cross-examined about purchases. It is to see how the particular, a teaspoon, an instruction to take 3 drops, becomes an instance of the structural, an imperial trade that made opium abundant, a chemical industry that made morphine measurable, a medical profession that learning as it argued, and finally a legal and public health apparatus that would try to contain both supply and harm. In the long view, these changes reframed what had once been called vice into a public problem, one that required public answers, better chemistry, stricter regulation of distribution, more careful training of prescribers, and ultimately a political reckoning with the empire that had commodified plant life into medicament and opiate into tincture. If the tale has a sombre aftertaste, it is not simply because deaths occurred or that mistakes were made. It is because laudanum's history insists upon an inconvenient fact about modernity, that convenience begets demand, and that a medicine that comforts one person will reorganise 1,000 bodies in ways that are not visible until they are. In the hush of a late room, the small glass bottle still sits like a promise or a threat. It teaches, softly, that every public health has a private provenance, and every private remedy can, when scaled, be a social problem. That is the lesson the Victorians began to learn between bedside and empire, between inquest and laboratory, and it is a lesson we continue to practice in forms they could scarcely imagine. They handled deaths with varying degrees of skill and humility. Coroners, sometimes appalled, sometimes confused, learned to call for dried sample jars, to request witnesses who had seen a bottle purchased, to put chemists through the agony of extracting a single alkaloid from desiccated tissue. In courtrooms, the presence of experts like Orfila or Alfred Swain Taylor prevents names that had acquired weight like the slow accumulation of layers in a textbook, shifted outcomes not by a single method but by changing the terms of the argument. A testimony that could say with confidence the decedent had a lethal dose of morphine in their blood made impossible the earlier comfort of acquittal by ambiguity. Some juries still hung on character and circumstance, some still preferred the melodrama of moral explanation, but the ground had moved. Science did not always clarify everything, it clarified enough, and behind it all the supply route, the long chain that began with poppy heads in Bengal and ended in a teaspoon on a mother's bedside table, taught the same patient lesson in a slightly different voice. That products travel, and that where there is demand, a supplier will find a way. The East India Company's regulation of opium grew into a political machine that reconciled cultivation and consumption, profit and the policing of trade. The remote farmer whose labour produced opium might have had no idea what the substance would become in an English sickroom. He tended sap and sold to an agent who bundled the crop for Calcutta auctions and final passage. The merchant's ledger did not record the human stories any more than a chemist's lab notes did. But together they produced abundance, and abundance remade habits. So the century left a mixed inheritance. On the one hand, there were improvements that would save lives and ease suffering in forms earlier physicians might hardly have dreamed. Pain could be managed, surgeries accomplished without the old tortures. Sleepless nights shortened. On the other hand, that relief was not free. It exacted an accounting in ruined households, in courtrooms, and in empires built with commodities that had a weight beyond the cargo manifest. The hidden epidemic of dependence that Laudanum both revealed and intensified forced, finally, a communal answer. It forced chemists to refine their tests, coroners to refine their questioning, doctors to refine their prescriptions, and legislatures, slow and reluctant, to think about the lines between medicine, market and morality. In the early years of the 20th century, those lines would finally be drawn with a new firmness in many countries. But this is not that century's story. The 19th century's achievement was simpler and subtler. It first named the problem and then, in fits and starts, built the instruments, surgical, chemical, administrative, to measure it. Gentle hands and hard ledgers together produced a modern awareness that a medicine, when scaled by trade and taste, becomes a matter of public consequence. And in that quiet recognition there sat, like the last sip from a teaspoon left on a nightstand, both consolation and warning. The world had learned to soothe itself in ways that demanded new forms of care. The bed, the bottle's provenance, all three mattered. In the quiet, lamplit shops of mid-Victorian Britain, where the smell of spirits and camphor braided itself through aisles of apothecary jars, change arrived not as a single loud law, but as a slow, bureaucratic tide that altered where and how people could find relief. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 in Britain was one of the first formal lines drawn. It set down the idea that certain substances were not to be treated as common grocery goods, but as things that required training, record-keeping, and a named professional to stand behind them. The law created a register, acknowledged the emerging professionalism of the chemist and pharmacist. The Pharmaceutical Society had been founded in 1841, and now the state began to recognise the need to distinguish expert hands from curious ones, and it gave ministers the power to define and police a list of poisons. The amber bottles that had once sat on grocers' counters, unlabelled or labelled with quaint trade names and salutary promises, increasingly belonged behind glass and under counters, where an apron and a certificate could be shown for a sit, or it's a small sober shift to imagine, the move from a world where every neighbourhood shopkeeper could hand you a draft promising sleep, to one where a ledger entry or a pharmacist's note was required. But it mattered. It rearranged access. There had been, until then, a culture of comfort in those drafts. Laudanum, as a tincture, was ubiquitous. Made by soaking opium in alcohol, it was easy to produce, easy to mix into other preparations, and easy to hide within euphemisms that soothed the conscience as well as the child. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, Godfrey's cordial, innumerable soothing and strengthening elixirs, carried opiates under the patina of home remedy. The bottles were small and warm in the hand, the taste were bitter and strangely sweet, and it quieted the house. For women exhausted by the demands of industrializing cities and for infants whose nights were long and wet, the syrup was immediate mercy. For the anxious middle class, laudanum was the quiet glass before bed. For the injured and the bereaved, it was a domestic anesthetic for sorrow. All of this was visible to social critics, though the remedial culture had its defenders too. Household remedies are, after all, a kind of domestic governance. Still, with the diffusion of mass-produced patent medicines and the accompanying advertising that promised panaceas, reformers began to pick out particular dangers. In Britain, the Sale of Food and Drugs Act of 1875 was another brick in the wall. Adulteration was suddenly a public problem rather than merely a private hazard. Authorities were given power to inspect and to seize. Labelling began to be taken seriously, if not yet perfectly enforced. Across the Atlantic, a noisier and more theatrical campaign gathered steam. In the United States, the turn of the century saw investigative journalists and chemists partner in exposing the gap between promise and content. Samuel Hopkins Adams's blistering N05 series in Collier's The Great American Fraud read like a slow public unmasking. Elixirs that promised to cure coughs, melancholia, sleeplessness or teething, pain, often contained alcohol, chloroform, cocaine, or morphine without any clear notice to buyers. Harvey W. Wiley, a chemist in the Department of Agriculture, had spent years testing foods and medicines. He came to embody the insistence that consumers had a right to know what they were ingesting. Their work pushed the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 across the finish line. It did not transform the market overnight, but it required an end to outright deception in interstate commerce. It required accurate labelling in ways patent medicine makers could not ignore, and it gave the federal government a legal tool with teeth. Those reforms, small and cumulative, were strategic rather than theatrical. They were logistics and lists rather than declarations of moral panic. Where laissez-faire had allowed commercially produced laudanum and other opium-based formulations to ride the rail networks from city to countryside, the new laws demanded transparency. Companies now faced the choice to declare that their soothing syrup contained opium or morphine, or to reformulate. Many chose declaration, but the public truth-telling had an electrifying effect. Once people knew what was in a bottle, morphine, alcohol, cocaine, their use of it was no longer an ordinary domestic practice, but a conscious ingestion of a powerful drug. That shift in consciousness is often overlooked, but it is a hinge. To name the habit-forming agent is to invite both stigma and regulation. It is to pull the comfort blanket away from the household ritual and put it under a glass label. International pressure followed national action. China had long complained, and by the early 20th century the language of policing opium use was international policy. The International Opium Commission convened in Shanghai in 1909, and then in The Hague in 1912. Governments from Europe, North America and Asia began to sketch an architecture of control that would, over the following decades, deepen into treaties and criminal codes. Britain, as colonial administrator of opium-growing India and as a market for patent medicines, had its own logistic interests. It participated in the slow work of turning a commodity that had been a legal export and a household ingredient into a problem to be calibrated by diplomats and statutes. In the United States, the legislative culmination of this turn came in the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914, which is at first glance a technical and perhaps drearily named law, but which in practice reconfigured supply chains and the legal status of opiates. The Harrison Act required record-keeping, registration and tax stamps for anyone who manufactured, imported, dispensed or sold opium, morphine or cocaine. It did not, at its inception, criminalise mere possession of a small amount, but the administrative requirements and police enforcement pushed distribution into the domain of licensed professionals and created penalties for those who circumvented the paperwork. The effect was to reroute the flow of opiates through medical channels and to sanction, by omission, an enforcement logic that treated many dependent people as lawbreakers rather than patients. The practical effects were immediate. Over-the-counter sales shrank. The gentlemanly corner grocer could no longer hand you a tincture with a wink. Pharmacists, who had been professionalizing for decades, became the gatekeepers of a new pharmacopoeic order. The man in the apron now kept a record book. Physicians, likewise, found themselves entrusted with both power and blame. Where once laudanum had been an instrument of domestic solace, it became, in law and in practice, a prescribed thing to be dispensed in measured amounts and noted in ledgers. This medicalization had a paradoxical side. For those who truly needed analgesia, miners crushed by machinery, women in childbirth, patients with cancer, access could become more restrictive at the same time as the medicine became more medical. For those who had been using such remedies in private, the new legal architecture could mean marginalization and criminal exposure. Black markets and informal networks adapted quickly, as they always do, and the sociological scaffolding of dependency shifted from the parlour to the clinic, from neighbourly exchange to under-the-counter transactions. You can see in this turn the seed of our modern dilemmas. When the law took aim at opacity, when it required that the bottle tell the truth about its contents, it did not erase demand. It reorganised supply, shifted stigma, and erected barriers that sometimes made care more difficult to access. Those barriers were not merely legal, they were professional and moral. Medicines moved into white coats and into prisons in roughly the same historical breath. It is no accident that the earliest decades of the 20th century see both the triumph of scientific chemistry in producing new, purer substances, and the first pains of modern epidemiology in noticing and measuring dependence. The pharmacological story that runs parallel to these regulatory developments is one of refinement. Chemists began to take apart the old tinctures, to identify their active constituents, and to give names to forces once seen as mysterious. Friedrich Seerturner, a young apothecary's assistant in Paderborn, isolated morphine from opium at the beginning of the 19th century, publishing his work in the first decades of the 1800s and naming the alkaloid morphium after Morpheus. His act was at once a triumph of chemistry and the opening of a new chapter in medicine. Where the opium poppy had been a complex, variable botanical with dozens of effects dependent on harvest, soil and artisanship, Morpheus was a chemical target, an object of measurement. The French chemist Pierre-Jean Robiquet would later isolate codeine in 1832. Others would pass the poppy's chemistry into a family of alkaloids which could be measured, manipulated and crucially standardized. Standardization brought clarity to therapy. It allowed physicians to talk in milligrams instead of vague drafts. It allowed manufacturers to stamp a dose on a bottle and theoretically to repeat that dose across hundreds of thousands of units. That predictability carried enormous benefits for surgery, for acute pain relief in the era before modern anesthesia, and for chronic conditions where reliable symptom control was a mercy. But it also carried a concealed risk. Potency, once standardized, could be scaled. The development of the hypodermic syringe in the 1850s, Alexander Wood in Edinburgh and independently Charles Prévaz in France gave the world a hollow needle instrument, meant that morphine could be delivered by injection. The injection offered immediacy. Blood-borne delivery meant that a dose would hit the brain more rapidly and intensely than the older oral tincture. The American Civil War provides a grim and instructive example. Surgeons used morphine for pain and for the horrifying wounds of battlefield medicine in the 1860s, administering it in large amounts to tens of thousands of soldiers. When peace arrived, a significant cohort of veterans found themselves dependent on the morphine that had been their solace through injury. The phrase soldier's disease was coined to capture the phenomenon. The scale was unmistakable. The technologies of precision, both the drug and the instrument that delivered it, had rewritten the relationship between suffering and chemical comfort. The chemical tinkering did not stop with morphine. In 1874, C.R. Alder Wright, an English chemist and physician, first acetylated morphine to produce diacetylmorphine. Later, at the end of the century, German pharmaceutical firms would resynthesize and market the compound that became commercially known as heroin. In 1898, the German firm Bayer introduced heroin as a cough suppressant and a supposedly less addictive alternative to morphine. There is a dry, ironic joke in that, a newly branded miracle intended to solve a problem created by an older drug, itself derived from that problem's chemistry. The name heroin, a word suggestive of heroism and strength to contemporary ears, was part of marketing's vocabulary. It wrapped the molecule in a cloak of virtue for the patient and profit for the firm. German chemists, trained in organic synthesis, and practiced in industrial processes thanks to the dye and chemical industries, had turned their techniques to pharmaceuticals, and thus to new markets. Park, Davis, Eli Lilly and others in the United States joined the trend. Companies scaled up extraction and synthesis, created standard tablets and injectables, and began to sell opiate derivatives not as artisanal tinctures but as branded remedies. The paradox of refinement should be underscored because historians and clinicians still tend to trot it out like a cautionary tale, but without its logistical detail. Purity and precision were life-saving in many contexts. They turned unpredictable tinctures into reproducible medicines. They allowed surgeons to plan, to titrate, to study dose-response curves. They built the foundations of modern pharmacology. Yet precisely because these molecules could now be delivered in known, repeatable quantities and through new routes that maximized their effect, they also created fresh pathways to addiction. A patient who had once taken laudanum by mouth in a dim parlour, dosing in teaspoons and guesswork, could now be given a measured milligram of morphine by injection that would sweep the nerves in a reliable arc. Repeat that reliable arc enough times and physiology and habit follow. Moreover, pharmaceutical firms armed with chemical expertise and marketing acumen had business incentives to promote the comfort these drugs offered, to expanding populations suffering with industrial accidents, chronic pain and social desolation. The commercial logic and the clinical logic, which sometimes aligned, sometimes did not, were now welded to the chemistry. The supply lines that fed this new pharmaceutical world were global and prosaic. Opium poppies were cultivated in fields overseen by colonial administrations in India and by farmers in the Ottoman territories and Persia. The raw gum travelled by ship to ports in Europe where alkaloids were extracted in laboratories, refined into products, packed in labelled boxes, and shipped again into pharmacies and hospitals across the Atlantic. The logistics were enormous, the same rail and steam networks that delivered manufactured textiles and coal-delivered drugs. Regulation, when it arrived, had to operate at that scale or falter. The very internationalism that pushed for treaty control of opiates also made enforcement complicated. Goods could be rerouted, reformulated or disguised, and criminal networks adapted supply chains with the same grim efficiency as legal commerce. Medicine tried to adapt. Some clinicians embraced drug-sparing strategies and non-opiate analgesics when they could. Others leaned into the new chemical tools. The medical community, meanwhile, had to reckon with physicians who were prescribers, some of whom were sympathetic to their addicted patients, and some of whom were the suppliers of dependence through careless or commercial practice. Early clinics and charities in the 19th and early 20th centuries experimented with approaches that combined moral suasion, substitution and confinement. The responses were uneven and often punitive. The legal turn toward registration, prescription control and eventually criminalisation meant that some people who had previously found a modicum of care under a physician's hand could see that hand withdrawn and the police step in. The social geography of addiction shifted from the kitchen table to the courthouse and the clinic. All of this history, regulation, chemical refinement, professionalisation, and the slow migration of drugs from domestic remedy to regulated substance, leaves traces in memory, in literature, and in the institutions we inherit. Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater, 1821, is the admittedly romantic self-exposing landmark of an earlier addiction culture. Coleridge's own entanglements with opium and laudanum added the aura of the poet to the drug's memory. But the cultural imprint is not only in great books, it is in the quiet mention of an amber bottle in a nurse's drawer in a Victorian photograph, in the way grandmother's recipes turn up in family papers, in the bitter chicory memory of a particular lullaby paired, in many minds, with the discreetly administered syrup. Laudanum's story became part of the ordinary language of consolation and of loss. Those memories and the legal legacies that accompanied them matter when we look at our own moment. The modern opioid crises, those waves in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, do not descend in a straight line from laudanum, but they echo its themes, the promise and the peril when new molecules are presented as safe relief, the way marketing reshapes clinical norms, the tension between access and control. The late 20th century saw new synthetic and semi-synthetic opioids, new delivery systems, and a new pharmaceutical industry able to generate blockbuster sales. Like their 19th century predecessors, those companies did not invent demand so much as cultivate and widen it. The regulatory architecture built in the early 20th century Recipes for labelling, prescription requirements, international treaties provided tools to address some of the harms, but it also created unintended consequences. The criminalisation of dependent people, the displacement of care into illicit markets, and the periodic cycles of substitution where restriction of one drug led to the rise of another, sometimes deadlier option. From the long view come practical lessons that are, quietly, rather obvious. Transparency matters. When a bottle's contents are known, patients and clinicians can make informed choices. When marketing obfuscates effects and risks, harm follows. Regulation needs teeth, but it also needs flexibility. The early 20th century pivot to criminal penalties often closed doors to medical help and pushed people into the shadows. Today's policymakers must remember that punitive approaches can worsen public health outcomes. A public health response that combines sensible supply reduction with robust access to treatment. Medications for opioid use disorder such as methadone or buprenorphine, harm reduction measures like naloxone distribution and supervised consumption sites, and social supports that address the economic and psychological drivers of substance use, is more likely to reduce both harm and stigma. Clinicians, armed with the knowledge of pharmacology and the memory of past mistakes, should favour careful prescribing, brief and clear patient education, routine screening for risk of misuse, shared decision-making about pain, and immediate provision of overdose reversal when appropriate. Systems like prescription drug monitoring programs provide essential surveillance, but they must be implemented in ways that do not inadvertently cut patients off from care. Policymakers should remember a different managerial truth. Supply chains and markets are resilient. Laws that ban a product do not end demand. They change the channel through which people seek relief. So the task is not merely to constrict markets, but to expand alternatives. Better pain medicine that includes non-opioid pharmaceuticals and non-pharmacologic interventions. Social programs that mitigate the despair that often underlies problematic use. And universal access to treatment for those who develop dependence. Regulation and professional ethics must be coupled with programs that reduce economic precarity, improve mental health services, and restore human connection in communities where isolation and industrial injury make chemical solace attractive. Historians have a duty too, albeit a quieter one. We must keep tracing the arc from the amber bottle to the ampule, from domestic tincture to prescription pad, and resist simplistic tales of moral failing. We must catalogue the administrative apparatuses, registries, tax stamps, poison lists, and remember that bureaucracies shape lives as surely as any moral injunction. We must attend to the voices of ordinary people caught in these transitions, the letters, the medical records, the court dockets, and the private diaries that preserve how medicine was used, misunderstood, loved, or loathed. If there is an ethical imperative in this historical work, it is to prevent the flattening of human complexity into policy slogans. People did not take laudanum simply because they were weak or criminal. Often they took it because the world offered them few other mercies. In the end, laudanum is both a medical artifact and a moral mirror. Its amber bottle reflects light in ways that make the face blurred. It taught regulators that truth on a label can protect, that scientific clarity can help but also harm without social wisdom, and that the mix of commerce, chemistry and care is combustible if left unchecked. Its history urges humility. Each generation, offered a new molecule and a new marketing pitch, will be tempted to believe that agony and sorrow can be neatly bottled. The technical answers of chemistry and the procedural answers of law will always be necessary, but they are not sufficient. The remedy must be social as well as pharmacological. Relief must be balanced with responsibility, access with accountability, and compassion with caution. So sleep for a while on these lessons that names on bottles can protect but cannot alone heal, that a ledger entry can limit supply but cannot mend the social fabric that first made painless nights so desirable, that the bright clinical promise of a purified molecule carries both mercy and risk. Remember the amber glass. Remember the little hand that reached for the soothing syrup. Remember the ledger that recorded a sale, and the courtroom docket that recorded a crime. In remembering, perhaps, we find the practical mercy of policy, clarity in labels, care in practice, and compassion in law.